Hi, this is Dr. Shannon Wong Lerner, host of The Intersection, where diverse folks converse. Created by and for queer people of color and gender nonconforming people, The Intersection is curated side by side with some of the most brilliant and fascinating minds in our community. I create these programs keeping in mind all of the things that aren't said and all of the things that we aren't able to talk about within heterosexual and cisgendered produced shows. In The Intersection, you'll find firsthand what the leading voices of our community are thinking, the work they're producing, the concerns they have, and what they hope for us and what they leave behind in their legacy. Thank you so much for joining us. Hi, this is Dr. Shannon Wong Lerner, and you're here with The Intersection, Diverse Folks Converse. This is episode 12, and we have here Dr. Kenneth Bryant Jr., who is Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of Texas at Tyler and Director of the Eden Film Series. So I'm so glad to have you here today.
Thank you for having me, Shannon.
And we're talking specifically about Black queerness in media. They Ain't Ready, But Here We Are is the title of this episode. And we came upon this theme and this sort of intersection between our own interests. First, because I had actually seen a post that Dr. Kenneth had put up on his social media about Lil Nas X and about Montero specifically. And it's something that like very different that I hadn't seen before, talking about what he had done in that video. So if you don't know about this video, there was a lot of controversy that came out around its release. And it's kind of almost like a throwback. You think of like, but it's different because it's racialized of the way people responded to like heavy metal music in the 80s, thinking about this kind of like alarmist, scapegoating, unable to see like artistic value, in something that perhaps was a very different perspective and a different form, right? And a different genre than they had experienced. And so I actually looked at that and I thought this would be such a great, person to interview for The Intersection, because we're always looking at ways to open up new frameworks to see queer people of color and our cultural worlds and our experience. And so, so I don't know if you want to talk about that a little before we start, because it was such a great post.
Yeah, and so the words that come to mind when I think of the reaction to the Montero video is moral panic.
Yes, moral panic.
And the video was released. We had the moral panic reaction. Conservative media picked it up, right? The images of the quote unquote satanic images, the hypersexuality
Sure.
of Lil Nas in the video. The reaction was a lot of clutched pearls, and some rolled eyes. And I was one of the ones who just sort of rolled my eyes, like, what's going on here?
Yeah.
And literally a couple of weeks back at the BET Awards, we got more taste of the moral panic in response to Lil Nas X.
Yes.
And the representation of queerness in the kiss that he had at the awards show with another Black man.
Yes.
And when I saw it, I was in the living room watching the show with my husband, and immediately my reaction was, oh, yes, right. I got excited because I knew what that meant.
Yes.
And the defiance that this particular artist is putting out there is refreshing. And that is sort of a part of this, they ain't ready, but here we are.
Yes.
Because at the end of the day, it's time, right?
It is.
Black queerness in media has been around for a long time. And right now, the language of Black queerness has been adopted into, or I should say appropriated into mainstream, right? Everyone's saying shade, everyone's saying read, right? All of this, the language is in the mainstream. So people will speak it, but they don't want to see it.
Yes.
And we're in a place now where like, that's not how it's going to roll anymore. And so, yeah, it's refreshing to see an artist that is a sort of an international superstar, unashamed and unapologetic in his Black queerness. And I think it's going to inspire a whole generation of Black queer folks to meet folks to meet folks in their face, right? And say, you got to see me.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think from the outside, for people that don't understand what's going on and don't understand the context, you know, of like Montero, or just like the simplicity of the kiss, like you mentioned, like having that be so visible and like, I want you to see this, I want you to see me. They'll see it in that moralization way. And that was actually one of the titles we had played around with, is this sort of like moralization of Black queer bodies, because it's like, you know, I'm not Black. I consider myself a person of color, but I do understand that. I feel like most of my life has been spent in like white worlds and white cultures. And I feel like for myself, I just have like a touch of that, where there's an expectation for me to speak a certain way, and for me to even at the core of like my work, the work I'm supposed to do, you know, like not wanting me to. I have Fred Moten here because he's someone with my last project I wanted to be more heavily represented. And if, for those of you who don't know who Fred Moten is, it says he's at University of California, Irvine. He's an associate professor of African American studies, visual studies, but also queer studies. And so he talks about that Black diaspora, but he talks also about homosexuality and like his own identity in that way. And his work is rich. It's almost like, you know, Marlon Riggs as a filmmaker, like I feel like people don't know who he is in this intersectional way. The last project I worked on, I wanted him to be more central, but because he was obscure, and you know, the person that even interviewed Marlon Riggs had asked him about these underground films, and he's like, they're not exactly underground. It's not like we're doing them in a basement and like, you know, the windows are all boarded up so no one can see. It's not like we're doing it covertly. We're actually just talking about our lives. And it was the same for Fred Moten, right? At the top of his game, a philosopher, he's intervening and intersecting all kinds of different voices, whether they're Western white voices or, you know, people like Frederick Douglass. You know, he does it all, right? And I feel like that's something that, like the comment with Lil Nas and what you just said, can be groundbreaking, even though it should be something that is just commonplace and accepted, right? Like, why can't we do it all? Because we have the capacity to do it all. Why do you have to limit ourselves in order to appear okay or non-threatening? And that's what I was told. That's what I've been told in some projects where I'm just trying to share my experience and trying to bring people like Fred Moten to the, you know, to the forefront, that I am confrontative, that rude, that I offend people, because I'm like, actually, this is the person you want to talk about, someone like Freud, for example, has been so overwritten and included in everything. Why don't we include someone, you know, like this? So I would like to turn to your Eden film series. Maybe we can use this conversation to pick up on that, because this is something I'm sure it exists elsewhere, but I haven't heard about it in a university context, that you have this Eden film series at the University of Texas at Tyler. I'd love to hear just like a quick synopsis of it, of this as like a current project and something I know you're heavily invested in order to bring these representations, right?
It's all about representation. We're a university, right? And the thinking was, it's important for students, particularly in the context of East Texas, which is,
Yes.
very homogenous, politically, racially, and all sorts of culturally. It's important that if students are going to come to the university, that they have access to other ways of being, right?
Yes.
That they can see, right? The whole point of coming to the university is not only sort of learning about other cultures, learning about other sorts of folks, but also developing that empathy muscle, right?
Yes.
And the one way to do that is sort of sit down and watch in an entertaining way, right? Entertainment, there's no sin in that, right? But also having discussions about what these various, the Eden stands for exploring diverse experiences and narratives,
That's
right?
great.
So diverse experiences and narratives is pretty wide.
Yeah.
And we have covered a wide range of issues. And that's the point. And so what I've done is use it as an opportunity not only to sort of allow for students to develop that empathy muscle, but also to reach out in an interdisciplinary way to my colleagues,
Yes.
faculty and staff across the university, to choose films that maybe are from their own particular background, maybe from their area of expertise that they can speak to, so that we can allow for sort of a contextualization of what the students are seeing in film and have discussions. And it has been wildly successful. It started off as sort of just a departmental thing where myself and a couple of colleagues from the political science department chose films, and students within our classes would come to the films voluntarily. And then it's since grown over the last 3 years across campus, in collaboration with other departments, in collaboration with university departments and other academic departments. And the students, I'll give you one example. Last year, the first film we watched in the fall was a film called Disclosure, which is a documentary, a Netflix documentary on representation of trans folks in media.
Yes, I've seen the film.
And it was an excellent film.
It was really good.
The opportunity to invite a trans man who's also a faculty member at our university to speak about these issues, because it's a part of his expertise, it's part of his area. And within this Zoom conversation, right, we're having a conversation about trans representation. And one of the students, we had, I take some credit, but I think it was, broadly speaking, an environment had been created, an environment of inclusion and safety and love had been created over Zoom.
Yes.
That was so powerful that a student came out in the comment section and shared that they had come out to their parents, and their parents had basically put them out, that their parents had denigrated them. And other students corralled around this student in the comment section and reached out and said, "We've got your back. If you need any assistance, we support you," and so on and so forth. And I'm engaging in the conversation while all of this is happening. And a colleague of mine sent me a text message and said, do you see what's going on in the comment section? And I said, no, I had to go look.
Yes.
And it just fills your heart that was happening in that context, in that conversation, for a student who ordinarily wouldn't have that opportunity. And that we created a space that was safe enough for that student to do what they did, told me that this is necessary.
Yes.
And it was just, from there, we have talked about all sorts of issues and addressed all sorts of experiences, from veterans who are dealing with PTSD, obviously queer folks, trans folks, women of color, Jewish folks, right, across the spectrum of newly immigrated folks.
Yeah.
So we watched a film called El Norte, which was from the 1980s. It's been a powerful experience, and I'm glad that it's been embraced by my colleagues. Couldn't happen without the support of my colleagues and without the participation of the students. and we're keeping it going. So
I'd love to hear a little bit about your personal experience around the Eden film series. So,
mhm.
like, what was going on in your life when you started it? How has that created, shifts for yourself personally? That story, the story you gave about the student coming out, in the comment section on Zoom, is kind of testament that the Eden film series really is like a community building experience. But what about internal? Uh, I wonder about that for you.
So in the very beginning, it was an idea that literally my colleagues and I were at a bar and grill,
Hmm.
and we were talking about movies. And I'm a cinephile, so I'm anytime I get an opportunity to talk about movies, I'm there, I'm game. And I said, what if we did some sort of like film series, film screenings of some sort? And I was adamant. I was like, we got to come up with a name. It's got to be punchy. And me and acronyms, we're best friends. So I was like, I got to come up with an acronym because acronyms are punchy, right? It's something you can use and put on flyers. And um, literally in that conversation, I came up with Eden. Literally threw just like words out and tried to put them together. The process of building acronyms, and got the buy-in from my colleagues who were sitting right at the table, talking about, at first it just was well, let's focus on representation and just pick favorite movies, right?
Sure.
Pick movies that you've seen that you really like, and that you think the students would get something out of. And so the very first film I chose, and we did it during Black History Month in 2018, Do the Right Thing. It
Yeah.
would have been 2019 because it would have been the 30th anniversary of
Mm.
the film's release in 2019. And so we did Do the Right Thing, and it was an opportunity for students to watch this film, which is a classic, right? But also have a discussion afterwards about how do we address racial inequality, sort of intercultural relationships and interpersonal communication, and indeed, how do we address racial inequality, particularly as it relates to police brutality and
Hmm.
police violence against communities of color? What is the right thing, right? We
Yes.
posed this question to students, and it was a powerful conversation, and I think that sort of set the precedent. And from there, we moved into talking about women's suffrage and the rights of women. And a colleague of mine, Mandy Link, who's a friend of mine and a colleague of mine, she is an expert on uh, Irish history, right? She's a historian. And so we had conversations about the experiences of the Armenian folks
Hmm.
and the relationship between colonization and fascism
Hmm.
and the genocide of a people, and on and on and on and on, having these conversations. And of course, COVID hit, and was like wondering, like, how are we going to keep this thing going? Zoom is a perfect.
And it's interesting because I
Um,
almost think like Zoom might have helped that student come out, because there's no way ever you would have this like big theater and some person like stands up, right? But the kind of like the anonymity of it, uh definitely can provide this safe space in a different way that we
yes,
hadn't imagined before COVID. i'm
yes.
um I'm curious about, like, because you're doing like some historical films, which I think
Hmm.
is really amazing if you think about sort of like the canon of Black cinema and what people know and what people don't know. I'm curious because you had turned me toward Marlon Riggs
Hmm.
to look up Black is Black Ain't, and I unfortunately wasn't. I thought I was going to be able to get on Amazon Prime before the interview, but when I went there, it wasn't available, and I wasn't able to get it. But I was able to hear an interview, an unedited interview from 1992, uh, that was uh, that was just him and one other person. I almost feel like she was either a young journalist or a student, from what I could hear.
Mhm.
And it was such a wonderful interview. You know, there is kind of this resurgence happening right now in, I feel like, public consciousness about Black cinema, Black representation, right? We have had like the Black Klansman and Sorry Not to Bother You, and, you know, all of the other films that have come out around these times that are both historical and then also trying to lead us to like, you know, a utopia with some of them. And Marlon Riggs even talks about that way early on, you know, before that had even happened. Um, I'm curious about the availability of these films. He had talked about that in that interview, and that even some of the platforms like PBS, at that time, you would think that they would have these things available. He had a film at the time called Tongues Untied,
Mhm.
and it was experimental. It was specifically on Black gay men and their stories and bringing out their voices. And he said that PBS, at least in Seattle and I believe Portland, they had chosen to put it on their calendar at 1 a.m. and 11 p.m. And when asked, why did you put this film, this very important film, on so late, the programming manager had said that he wanted to make sure that the people were watching it were the people who were supposed to watch it, or who meant to watch. He didn't say supposed to, meant to watch it, and that someone didn't just stumble upon it by mistake, at which Marlon Riggs said,
Heaven forbid.
yeah, that means that you didn't think it was important, right? Because isn't that the purpose of PBS, that you're supposed to watch things that you haven't been exposed to before? And then he also said, you know, with how important it is now in public culture and like for in society, with sexuality, race, repression, self-loathing of the body for, you know, Black queer folks, and like, why would, that was what he asked him, why would you show this so late? That's what he asked him. I'm curious if you think about, because of this resurgence. So I also went back and watched Paris is Burning. We can talk about that a little later, by Jenny Livingston, which came out in around the same time. Was it 1990, 1992?
I think it was 89
Oh,
or
it was
80.
89. Okay, so it was
You
even
know what?
earlier.
You know, that's a good question. I may be thinking of when it was filmed and not when it was released. But yeah, it was around that time, that turn of in the 80s and 90s, or late 80s, early 90s. Yeah.
I'm bringing it up because I'm thinking about, you know, there's a reason why these stories are being told now. Think about Pose, for
Mm-hmm.
example, set place in the late 80s to, I'm guessing it's going to be early 90s. And thinking about like how important HIV/AIDS was within the community, and very specifically, you know, within the Black male and Black community at the time, Black queer community, and how these, I feel like young, I need to get more young people on here, because I feel like I say these things and I don't know if this is true, but I do feel like young people, I know this is a fact, like they haven't experienced this kind of thing. They experienced the pandemic of COVID, but they did not experience the pandemic of HIV/AIDS, and they don't understand what that was
Including
like.
me. Yeah,
Yeah,
including me. Yeah.
sure. And I was a kid, so in a way I didn't experience it, you know, firsthand. I do remember as a teen, you know, seeing people who had it and losing them. I just didn't know them very well, but I know it existed. I think I'm older than you must be.
One of the most harrowing experiences I've ever had in my life was back about, I guess it would have been 10 years ago or so. I was a part of a group of gay men in the Cleveland area. And a lot of the gentlemen who were part of this group were older gentlemen. So they
Yes.
lived through HIV/AIDS,
Yes.
plague. And we sat around and we had a conversation. And really, it was me listening to these gentlemen share about how many people they lost,
Yes.
how an entire generation of their friends
Just gone.
and really their family, their chosen family, gone. And how they had to really endure that survivor's guilt uh,
Yes.
and continue on in this world, uh, leaving behind so many
Mhm.
and picking up the pieces and trying to rebuild community in that vulnerable state. It was an extremely powerful conversation. I'll never forget it, and I'll never forget that feeling of, my goodness, right? We don't know, right? I
Yeah.
have no, I'm fortunate enough to not have experienced that. But it's important that folks my age and younger
Mhm.
have that perspective. And that's why someone like Marlon Riggs is so important,
He is.
because the work that he created, while it's hard to access, it is accessible. One
Yes.
service that I wanted to mention for folks is Canopy,
Oh, okay.
which is a streaming service that is attached to library cards. So if you're part of your
Oh,
local public
great.
library, and that you can access, or at least you could, Black Is, Black Ain't, and Tongues
Yes.
Untied,
Oh, good.
the Canopy streaming platform. And as a matter of fact, my initial speaking about sort of Eden and exposure to these stories in at the university level, my initial introduction to Marlon Riggs and his work was in college.
Yeah.
I took a political science courses, and my professor, while the political science courses, you know, and that's one of the things that I think you have a question about when I say sort of attacking sort of well-worn conventions within my profession about
Yes.
what it is to be Black and Blackness. But uh, he didn't accept this idea that political science had to be this sort of anodyne, race neutral conversation where we're not discussing race specifically. As a matter of fact, he took time to discuss race, not just in the in the African American politics courses, but in just regular political science courses and political behavior and such. And one of the films he showed was Black Is, Black Ain't.
It's great.
And so that was sort of my introduction to Marlon Riggs and some other. He also showed a documentary on Franz Fanon and
It's
all these
wonderful.
sort of radical voices at a
Mhm.
time when that was not an easy thing.
Yes.
And that, I guess, the Eden series for me, and some part of me, is sort of paying that forward, paying that tradition forward, because I don't think I would have been exposed to folks like Marlon Riggs and
Exactly.
understood the visibility, the importance of visibility for Black queer people, if I didn't have those classes and watch those movies.
Yes.
I don't know that I would ever have had exposure to that. So yeah, a part of sort of my motivation is paying that tradition forward. Now that I'm in the position of being sort of a gatekeeper,
Yeah.
being the person who gets to make a decision on what it is my students are exposed to. It's one thing that I think is important for not just the Black queer kids that may be in my class, but for the
Mhm.
folks who aren't, who need to understand what life is like for Black
Yes.
and brown queer folks.
Yeah, I really love that interview, and I'm so glad that you introduced me to him, because now I can pay it forward, like on the intersection and elsewhere. I think, you know, some of the things that he talked about this sort of pain and the damage of, and something I could relate to as someone who's a person of color, queer person of color, and someone who was closeted for most of my life.
Mhm,
So he talked about internalized imagination. And in
mhm,
the same way that you talked about how narratives and seeing them on film and the entertainment and kind of the emotional investment that people can have within the characters and the stories of these films can be so moving and have such an impact, it opens up minds, right? and
yes.
and and creates change, like the student coming out and then people being like, I know that person, and like
Mhm.
that's so courageous, and having this real thing happen. That was another one of the titles that we had thought of for this talk. Was, what was it? It was something about um art as reality, or you were the one that came up with, I can't think of it,
Oh
but
Lord, I don't
it's
remember.
okay. It's all right. But there's something interesting, I think, to be said about what film can do, what these representations can do. And Marlon Riggs had talked about My Private Idaho as an example of,
Mm,
Black characters being these kind of tropes that we see over and over again,
yeah.
where they're murderous, they're homicidal, and they're generally seen in this sort of unsavory and criminal way. And in the way it makes you know people of color and Black characters kind of represented this inhuman way, and that toll it must take internally. I'm really curious about how important would it be then, and like the films you choose, for Black filmmakers to then, take back, reset, decenter those narratives. And Marlon Riggs had also talked about to create new images, new dynamics, representations. And he had even said utopias, where you think about the films that are coming out now, although it's almost a dystopia when I think of Sorry to Bother You. But I can't believe I'm not thinking, but well, Black Panther would be the remedy to that, right? Not that Sorry to Bother You was a problem, but there's definitely a positive message, but there's a lot of dystopia in it. I'm really curious about how you feel like that. And we can also talk about the Jenny Livingston part after this, but how important it is for films made by Black filmmakers to take back those narratives, and then for the people that are impacted, that are consuming those narratives, right? Interacting with them.
Yeah, it's super important. And I know one of the frustrations that I've had and I've read about, particularly as it relates to Black queer folks, Black queer men in particular, is that one of the tropes that still endures today is the sort of sidekick, the Black gay sidekick, who's sort of not a three-dimensional person, asexual.
Almost like a helper, like the helper.
There to crack some jokes.
Yes, right? Of course.
There to sort of, I guess, be the token in the film.
Non-threatening.
Non-threatening. Like I said, asexual. They don't have a sort of an existence outside of sort of probably the lead white character. Yes. And there to crack jokes and be sassy, right?
Yes,
that is the trope of the sort of Black gay sidekick. And I think if you talk to Black creatives, writers, directors, actors, they would argue that it isn't that they want to eliminate that particular character because that particular character exists in real life. It's that they want to create more opportunity for other types of characters.
Like the hero, that's what Marlon Riggs had talked about too, right? Not having it always be a white male heterosexual hero figure. I mean, even, when I think about Sorry to Bother You, the female character really bothered me, even though she's like a performance artist, because I feel like she kind of did that sidekick. Like she was highly sexualized. She was always having sex with everyone. And the way they dressed her, just having her nipples covered in that one scene. And I was just like, come on now. Like what? Like there was a great opportunity for her to be a true partner with the male lead, right? But instead she really wasn't. You're about midway through the Intersection Diverse Folx Converse podcast. I wanted to take a moment to let you know why I created the Intersection. It was because I didn't see a lot of representation of the most brilliant and creative minds in our communities. All I saw were misrepresentations in popular culture and the media. So I wanted to provide a free and accessible outlet for us all to enrich our lives and to provide meaning for the things that we experience every single day. None of us get paid for the Intersection, and this is not a income generating endeavor for any of us. We do this because we want to add to our culture and we want to add to your lives. So we just ask that you participate as well and contribute to us through subscribing to our channel and leaving reviews and telling your friends and telling the community. Put it up on web boards, share it in social media, tell people about us, but really subscribing, adding the reviews to Dr. Shannon Wong Lerner's YouTube channel, which houses the Intersection, to the Intersection on Apple Podcasts or Spotify is really the best way to let other people know about us and to help us increase our visibility so we can increase yours. Thank you so much, and you can now return to the show, and thank you for listening.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I think when we talk about representation, tropes are tropes
Sure.
But I think what folks are asking for is the creation of and the privilege to be other types of characters that are Black and queer, but aren't defined by their Black queerness, that they are just characters.
And not defined maybe by the cisgendered white heterosexual idea, projection of what Black queerness is, right? But it's like, no, this is actually how I am as a Black queer person, not your idea, because I'm pandering to you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's this strange, relationship between, within our community where it's we want to embrace folks for who they are, but there's also there's a double consciousness where we want to embrace folks for who they are, but also there is a segment within the community that's, if this person is say it's a man who happens to be gay and he's especially feminine or presents feminine, that there's a sort of internalized misogyny, homophobia situation going on where there's shame attached to that outward expression of femininity, which we've seen with Lil Nas X. And so even within the community, there's a segment that would like to box representation of Black queerness and present to the heteronormative world the individual within this box,
of course,
as a representation of. And I think within the community and without, there needs to be a sort of radical push away from boxing individuals and allowing for folks, creatives, to create characters that, like you said, are not bound by these norms, and these norms created by white cisgender folks. And I think that's the real push. And I think that, again, that is the legacy of someone like Marlon Riggs. And I think that's the legacy of folks who are a part of projects like Pose, and the legacy of Paris is Burning, and so much, so many other sort of powerful queer voices in media that are today, fortunately, more empowered. I don't know that they are in a position that they would say they are sort of in the driver's seat, but certainly more empowered to present different forms of Black queerness. And
Marlon Riggs had talked about that too, is like when you talk about Black, well, actually it was the only thing I was able to access of Black is Black Ain't, but I think it was like a trailer. And it was saying, like, you talk about what Black community is, right? And you can't really use that in this. And we experienced that with this, Stop Asian Hate. And all of a sudden now there's visibility on Asian people. And then my whole life, people have talked about Asians in this monolithic way. And, I always have to remind them, like, what Asia is, that it's actually a continent and that there are, like, other people who are part of this too. And so, I'm really curious about that, that multiplicity, intersectional aspect of what we're talking about. Is one of the reasons why Lil Nas X is such a, I think, important figure for this conversation. And then also thinking about Pose and Blackness, queerness, and transness being part of this too. I'm really curious about, like, how do you think intersectional racism against Black queer bodies and figures, including homophobia, transphobia, even femphobia, and the thing you wanted to talk about, which I do want to talk about, this idea of Black queer masculinity, not being part of this narrative, because that's a very particular box. And I had brought that to you too, is that I was really excited that there were these narratives around Naomi Osaka and Serena Williams about Black female bodies, in the public, and how there was a pushback on, like, don't want you to put me in this box, right? And an insistence, like, we have control of your body, we have control over the narrative, and we're going to spin it in a certain way. And they're like, no, you're not. And so there's the kind of spillage that is happening that I think also pertains very much to this, Black queer masculine representation that should be multiple, should be intersectional, should be not a monolith, not just the sidekick, right? And then,
Right.
Even thinking about Lil Nas, as how do we talk about Lil Nas because of that white, cisgendered, heterosexual lens that I feel like he is existing outside of, which is very courageous. How do we talk about these representations? Where are they manifesting elsewhere? Why do you think it's so important? Like with Lil Nas post that you had written, I have a quote in here somewhere. You had said y'all wrote the script, and that you said that this idea of flipping that toxic and deadly script on its head, that's what Montero did to create a tonic, right, for Black queer youth and people, and that he'll save Black queer lives with it. That's what you had said, which I really loved. Why is it so important to talk about this in social media? Why is it so important to like hunt and find these representations in film that, I'm guessing you're bringing to the Eden series?
When you discuss intersectional, sort of the intersectional barriers, the intersectional wages of prejudice for Black queer folks, the thing that I think of is, as a Black gay man, there are times in life where you're like, where do I go for respite, right? If I exist outside of the norms of masculinity, so when I put in quotes on that, and being gay for many folks means that I exist outside of those norms. Within my community, within the Black community, and I've just been having a reckoning just this year with family on this very subject. Whose arms can you run to?
Yes.
And then, of course, if you're Black, you exist outside of the norm of sort of the quote unquote racial mainstream. And to not have a place to go, except perhaps in media.
Yes.
Except perhaps in images. For so long in my life, I never had a physical person that I knew that identified as queer.
Yes.
Let alone identified as or was Black and queer. And so the only respite I had was in movies.
Yes.
And growing up, it was Tu Wong Fu, right? I don't know if you've seen the film.
No, I haven't seen that.
Patrick Swayze and Wesley Snipes and John Leguizamo are drag queens.
Oh, yes, I did see that.
Yeah.
I saw that in high school. I remember that.
And as dated as that movie is now, right?
Sure.
Drag queens who are not trans women are traveling across the country as drag queens.
And they kind of look like some of them look like bodybuilders. So I remember when I heard Patrick Swayze was chosen, I was like, really? How does that work?
So as dated as that movie is, it was so important for me.
Sure.
And because where did I have to go? I had nowhere to go in terms of sort of expression. And so, as you mentioned about why is it important for forms of media like someone like Lil Nas X, I'm thinking about Lil Me, who exists today in 2021, who had nowhere to go, no one to speak to about it. But look at this, I can go to YouTube and I can seek out this personality on social media who's very defiant, who's very resistant of people placing him in a box.
Yeah.
That is empowering. I gotta believe that's empowering for young queer Black kids.
Sure.
And that's what I meant by a tonic, because some, I was fortunate, but some are not in terms of their mental health and whether or not they can endure that existence for so long, particularly through their adolescence, but also in their young adulthood and when they're older. To be isolated is hard. Sure. And so to have visibility and have someone who's saying, it's all right, I'm going to be defiant. Not only is it all right, but I'm going to tell y'all, I'm here, I'm going to be how I am, and that's just the way it's going to be. That's got to be empowering, and it's got to be a salve, a saving for those kids out there who don't have anywhere else to turn. Pose, doing the same thing.
Definitely.
I'm positive for young trans folks of color who are like, other than that, who was the face of transness is Caitlyn Jenner, right?
Yes.
And now Caitlyn is running as a Republican for governor.
Sure, a Trump supporter.
Right? Yeah, so there's this, that's a little weird. So we've got a show like Pose. We've got folks like Janet Mock and Laverne Cox who are powerful women, right? Articulate women, beautiful women who are advocates and activists, and also brilliant performers and brilliant editors, writers, directors. And that's a net positive. That's a good.
Sure.
And the more we have of that, the better. I would say.
I'm curious. I'm curious about what we were just talking about before about this sort of Black female representation, that being kind of like a new thing in mainstream media, but them talking about Naomi Osaka and Serena Williams and different ways that they've been treated, I feel like unfairly and poorly as compared to their white competitors, and the narratives in the media and the way they're represented. And, why do you think those representations are more acceptable? And those are talking points, right? For like NPR and so on. But Lil Nas isn't. Like, one thing, and I don't know if this is I don't know if this is a weird thing to say, but my past partner, whom we broke up about 2 years ago, is Black male, very kind of like traditionally masculine looking. And he would often complain, and then he did voice work. So he had this very like low voice. He would complain, and I saw it, well, actually I saw it everywhere, but I saw it very prominently firsthand once where I was standing there, where he was like sexualized as looking, because he looked a certain way, and because he was Black and he was masculine and he had muscles and whatever, that whole thing. Although he didn't identify that way, it's just how he looked, right? Is there something about, Black queer masculinity that takes the public away from that sexualization, and maybe perhaps that's one of the reasons why we don't see more Black queer, masculine figures at the forefront in mainstream media and culture, as compared to like, Serena Williams, Naomi Osaka, they're defiant too, as being Black and as being women, but they're straight. They're still part of this sort of acceptable discourse. And I'm so sorry, the lady who's slipping my mind, who was just rejected from the Olympics.
Sha'Carri Richardson.
Yes, I think that it is it. Her, I feel like she is a hero in many ways, but I also feel like she's not being talked about in the same way, in this way that's like interesting in the media as like Naomi Osaka and Serena Williams. But aside from that, I'm curious if like perhaps, Black masculine queer figures haven't been more in the forefront because white cisgendered heterosexual dominant media and culture doesn't know what to do with them. And they have been taken out of this sort of sexual economy, way that they have been, some people have been represented, that trope.
Yeah, I mean, and when we say masculine, we're talking about traditional hyper-masculine.
Well, when I say, I'm talking about like our version and what we were trying to create on the show, like Lil Nas X is masculine, right? In this Black queer sense, but there's this toxic masculinity, like my ex-partner, because he had been like a traditional fighter and done all this training, had that appearance of that toxic masculine projection that women would put on him everywhere we went almost, but he rejected it. And I feel like there is a rejection with figures like Lil Nas X, and like him showing his sexuality on Montero, and like other public venues, but it not being the right kind, right? I'm wondering if you can speak to that, because I do think it's something interesting to think about in terms of like sexual economy and, you know, mass media and what can be consumed and what can't.
It's a great question, and I don't know that I have a ready-made answer for it. I think it goes back to what are the cultural expectations of gay men, particularly Black gay men? What have we seen?
Yes.
And what we have seen is not what you were referring to with your ex, which is the quote unquote hyper masculine, toxic masculine exterior. It further complicates it when we talk about like Black men, because Black men, the Black male body has been hypersexualized, but also feared. And Black gay men, at least as we've seen in media, sort of have existed in this space where it's not necessarily to be feared, but to be ridiculed.
Yes. So it goes back to that ridicule part.
And so I think it goes back to where the box exists for Black gay men in media and in culture, really. And I think the box exists, or the people that exist within this box, or at least the ones that are going to be most visible, are folks who fit the non-threatening trope, the asexual trope.
Yes.
You cannot. So when we talked about the sidekick, right? There's no room for your ex, if he were a gay man, right, as the sidekick in this particular, in any particular project, because it just doesn't fit that box. It doesn't fit that expectation. And so I think, I don't know how good of an answer that is, but yeah, I think it's about, we all exist, at least in media, within boxes, or at least they try to put us in boxes. And as you mentioned before, I don't know that they know what to do with, because you can't make, it's the same thing with white gay men, right? There's the age-old position they're put in, because why they don't come out necessarily is because casting directors won't make them leading men, because they don't think that women would see this gay man or be able to sort of believe that this gay man could woo this woman because he's a gay man in real life, but he's an actor. Like, there's this weird thing. So it's the same thing with Black gay men in that the box, right? And I don't know, it's gonna take boundary pushers like Lil Nas X and others to change that expectation and change that norm. And we do see, right, if you look specifically at Black gay media, right, niche media, you do see the quote unquote traditional masculine queer folks. But if you're talking mainstream, there's a type. And we're just now reaching the point where maybe we're pushing out of that, hopefully.
Yeah, I'm also thinking about, we haven't really talked about it yet, but your own work, like your own academic work, and how the Eden series kind of fits alongside that. And I know that you finished your dissertation like sort of recently, like 2018, right? And it seemed 17. Like, was it?
17.
17.
Right.
Okay. I remember we talked about this when we spoke the first time, and that you had said it was a really good time to finish that writing. I'm curious about like what has changed for you as compared to then and now. Also thinking, kind of about that conversation we just had about the 90s and then now, and why it's so important to bring these discourses forward. But also people like Marlon Riggs, when I heard him, and here he is talking in 1992, he's talking about things that still haven't happened or just starting to happen in film culture now, right? With Black filmmakers and themes that are finally starting to open up and shift within that narrative. What has happened for you and alongside the Eden series since you first wrote your dissertation, which was about Black social movements, right, and protests within a political science framework, and now? Do you feel like there significant shifts have happened?
Oh boy. Actually, my frustration is I feel like it's sort of been Groundhog Day,
Okay.
where every year the same conversation is being had, and we're not getting anywhere. But a little bit about my dissertation. My dissertation was written as a story, and the story was about Black public opinion as it relates to how police officers are responding to public protests related to police violence. And, throughout the dissertation and in the first parts of it, it's about the history of the Black community and police, right? Going back to the slave patrollers, right? And there's a lot of discourse and a lot of discussion being had over the last few years, particularly last year, on that relationship and the fruit it has bear, the poison fruit that it has bear. But since writing that dissertation, it has felt like every few weeks, if not every few months, we have the same predicament. Someone is murdered by a police officer. Protests happen.
Yes. Protests
are squelched.
Yes.
One form or the other. And then we move on. And we have a little bit of, outrage, and then we move on.
Yes.
And that has happened, I feel like, every year, every few months since that dissertation was written to today, right? Last year was a bit of a reckoning point where it sort of went even broader than normal with George Floyd's murder. And part of that is because it was even more egregious than other instances. And it's not that we haven't seen other instances recorded. It wasn't that. I guess it was just the depravity and the barbarity of what happened to him that really just outraged even more than normal. But in terms of what has changed, I think I've gotten more cynical.
Okay.
I think I've gotten, in the time since that was published, it's a weird place to be in. And I talked about this last year in another interview, where in my particular area, there's a lot that I could be writing about and studying, whole lot. But as a Black man, I feel a bit paralyzed by it all, emotionally.
Yes.
I feel a bit drained and exhausted by it all. And so it's hard on the writing front, on the academic front, to continue to do the work that I do and have been doing with relation to police violence and public, which is why probably I've been working on other things. But when we talk about Eden, the story that I'm telling in that dissertation is a story, is a glimpse into sort of historical context and perspective that explains what we're dealing with today, but also takes an intersectional approach to, as you mentioned before, in terms of sort of the Asian community.
Yes.
Not think of the Black community, particularly all Black folks, as a monolith on this particular issue or any issue, right? And so, one thing in political science that I found out early in graduate school is that when we talk about race, we talk about Black folks, and Black folks are Black folks. And then everybody else, right? There's literally a monolith. It's just literally a line on sort of the regression table. And I don't want to do that. And so I wanted to spend more time focusing on age and focusing on gender and focusing on other and class, education, things of that nature that are important in terms of coloring and figuring out what the actual views and attitudes of Black folks in this country are with relationship to police violence, but also other issues. And so that is about highlighting different narratives and different experiences.
Yeah.
And that's what Eden is about. highlighting different narratives and different experiences where there may be differences,
Mm-hmm.
even within a community.
Sure.
In this case, the Black community, where there may be differences within other communities. That's important to know, that we don't lock people into giant groups and then just assign all these characteristics to them, whether it's queer, whether it's Black and queer, whether it's Black cis, whether it's, white. There's a lot of different stories to be told.
Yes.
And I think that's important. And so, yeah, unfortunately, I think I've gotten more cynical about this whole ordeal.
And I think, the friends of mine who are they're activists within the Asian American community kind of express something similar, where it's like there was this explosion of concern for Asian Americans, and then all of a sudden it just like stopped, right? Yeah. And even if it's still happening, I don't know if there's like a timer that goes off. I don't know how this happens. That there were tons of people between Rodney King and George Floyd who were experiencing that kind of brutality. Mm-hmm. But there was something that happened that made the public ready and interested to look at it. But there was a limitation. There was also a timer on it. So we can be concerned about this for half a year. We can be concerned about this for a year. We're going to put Black Lives Matter in our hashtags, and then it just goes away, right?
Well, and then you get the bad faith actors and propaganda entrepreneurs who come out and, they spread poison and misinformation and disinformation through social media.
Yes.
You talked about the importance of social media. That's one of the reasons why I think social media is such an important platform, and why, I would have put what I put out there about Lil Nas X, but they use this platform, and the sort of multiracial coalition that was created, it's hard to sustain when you start to introduce sort of this poison and try to wedge people, and you start to characterize things like defund the police, and you mischaracterize critical race theory.
Yes.
You introduce all these sorts of poison pills. And that is the frustrating thing as an educator.
Yes, of course. Because this is what I was just talking about with the guest that's coming up with. Dr. Daniel Coleman wants to talk about Black trans relationships and why it's only that, pretty much, are people of color and trans. But there's all these projections that, to wade through. I also think it's kind of testament for, Eden Film Series and what you're trying to accomplish there. And the hopefully what is long lasting about those narratives is those stories that kind of imprint on us with film. Hopefully they're going to, create a tension between that misinformation within social media. Because even though it's quick and people digest it quickly and it might have somewhat of an imprint, there's something emotional about those films that hopefully will survive past, the influence of social media, and will surpass it. I'd really like to know how people in the intersection can find out more about Eden, and we can also put a link in our description of this podcast. And I'd love to hear, I always ask guests, what is their takeaway from your episode, from this time that we've had together? Something that you learned, something you're going to walk away with that you didn't have when you first came here.
Well, you can find the Eden podcast, which is basically a extension of the series. It's basically the recorded sessions of the conversations about the films. You can find that on any platform in which you listen to podcasts. So
great.
Spotify, Amazon, not Amazon. But,
and so you can give us that link too, and we can put that on there. I think that'll be wonderful.
Yeah, and that is, like I said, those are basically just the recorded sessions of the conversations that we have within the series. And that was an idea that I had just a couple of months ago. Like, we've got to figure out a way to create a record, right?
Yes.
And people can access these conversations.
An archive.
Because they're very important. Yes, an archive. And what was the second question?
Your takeaway. What is something that you gained from this conversation that you didn't have when you first came?
I didn't realize just how wedded to Black queer representation has been in the work that I've done, even on a subconscious level, and how much I think someone like Lil Nas X has empowered even me.
Yes.
Right? All these years later, being who he is authentically and unapologetically and defiantly is a very encouraging for someone like myself who is, a junior faculty member trying to get tenure, trying to work in a profession that, is dominated. So these are white spaces, and really taking some of that strategy and bringing it into my own profession and not allowing myself to sort of be shrunk down and made invisible, or my Black queerness to be shrunk down and made invisible. That is something that can empower folks who are even beyond sort of his age range and people who are sort of fans of his music, but also folks like me and you and others who are within our own professions who need encouragement as well. And I'm encouraged all the time by my students.
Yeah.
And so that's not a different feeling for me to be encouraged by someone younger and empowered. So,
and that youthful spirit that can kind of rejuvenate a movement or a consciousness.
If you're not resistant to it.
If you haven't become too much of a curmudgeon, that you're like,
and that's the thing. I was just saying this again in the conversation the other day. I was like, I just want to make sure that I don't in 20 years find myself a part of sort of this regressive way of thinking where I'm no longer allowing for the boundaries and the norms to be pushed because I'm in a comfortable place.
Sure. I hear that all the time with people who are political.
That's the great thing about being in a university setting. If you allow it, you're always going to have young, fresh ideas, young minds.
And hopefully people that are open and feel safe enough to challenge you, right? Because that is what higher education should be.
Yes, and that's growth. And I just don't ever want to be in a place where I'm resistant to that. So I'm always going to make sure that I'm keeping my ideas fresh.
That's good.
And young people, right? They do that for us. So
I feel like my main takeaway was watching the Marlon Riggs interview. I can't wait to see his work. Talking to you about sort of like all these different periods and films, from the 80s on, and thinking about now hearing your perspective, like you were like, I did this important work with my dissertation, Black queerness and Black queer masculinity is still a big part of my work and my subconscious. And, but that you don't necessarily feel this like Obama hopefulness or something, it's like, not like, yay, but it's like, now where the real work is. It makes me really think about that, having more representation, having accessible platforms like the Intersection and the Eden series, how important that is, because this work keeps going, right? It's not going to reach a panacea point and then it just like everything goes away, that we have to keep recycling, and Marlon Riggs, a lot of those ideas. I'm like, yes, people are talking about this now and it still hasn't happened, right?
Dark forces are constantly adapting, changing, morphing. There are new variants and the forces of good. We got to do the same thing.
So we got to keep going and can't shut down but I understand what you're saying too. It's like sometimes I get so overwhelmed with the weight of the work and the weightedness of, me wanting to stay in touch with what's going on. It can be painful, but find a way to get support, find a way to be around positive people who are doing that same kind of work can help prop you up.
Yeah.
And thank you so much for being here. I feel like that was an important takeaway for me today because I've been feeling that weightedness lately.
Yeah, and it's the burden. It's the burden we bear. But I appreciate the opportunity to come and speak to your audience, and this is an important platform, and so Thanks again for inviting me.
Thank you so much. I just want to close saying this is episode 12 of The Intersection, and we talked about Black queerness in the media. They ain't ready, but here we are. We've been here with Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of Texas at Tyler, Director of the Eden Film Series, Dr. Kenneth Bryant Jr. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
You've just finished an episode of The Intersection, Diverse Folx Converse podcast. I'm so happy that you decided to join us and you finished the whole podcast to hear all about the stories and lives and the experiences of our guests. I would like to just offer you right now an opportunity to continue to listen to us. You can always find us here at Anchor under The Intersection, Diverse Folx Converse, Folx Folx, or you can find us on YouTube under Dr. Shannon Wong Lerner, Lerner, YouTube channel. We also have a Facebook page, also under The Intersection, Diverse Folx Converse, that you're welcome to join to find out all about upcoming episodes and guests. Thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next time.